Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening. My name is Amelia Watkins-Smith. I am a PhD student at the University of Nottingham, and I also work as a research associate here within the Rights Lab, also in Nottingham. And my research is primarily interested in the trafficking of women and girls into China for the purposes of forced marriage and childbearing. And so today I'll be presenting a feminist analysis of that social problem, so some research that I've just recently conducted. And before I get into it, I do just want to issue a trigger warning to say that the content of my research and by extension this presentation does include gender-based violence, including sexual abuse and rape. So, just making sure my tech all works. This is my second time trying to do this presentation, but I think we're all good now. So, by way of introduction, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of intending spouses. Yet today, over 7 decades later, forced marriage persists as a significant social problem in our global society, and the most recent estimates suggest that 15.4 million people globally were living in a position of forced marriage on any given day in 2016. Now, this includes women and girls, as I said, who were trafficked into China for the purposes of forced marriage. And this is generally termed Chinese bride trafficking, and I'll be using the term Chinese bride trafficking going forward in this presentation. I'm specifically looking at the nations of Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, and North Korea. So I've just put a map there in case that's helpful. Now, within existing literature, Chinese bride trafficking, regarding Chinese bride trafficking, there is this agreed core assumption that it is, and I quote, at its core, a profound expression of gender discrimination. However, there's not yet any clear evidence or understanding of how constructs of gender operate within this specific context. So this research presents a unique contribution to the field by analysing Chinese bride trafficking through a specifically feminist lens. And so through this presentation, I'll first unpack existing literature in a bit more detail. And here I really aim to paint the picture and introduce you in a bit more depth to this social problem and why we think it might be happening. And then I'll establish my research, I'll set out my methods and then present my findings and analysis. So, existing literature broadly addresses 2 key elements of Chinese bride trafficking. So on the one hand, we have this Chinese demand for forced marriage, and on the other hand, we have this supply of vulnerable women and girls in neighbouring nations who can meet this demand. So I'll first address the demand side of the issue, if you like. So the high Chinese demand for forced marriage is a result of multiple intersecting factors. I've broadly made these into 3 categories, but I'm sure there's more here. But just by way of introduction, Chinese culture, firstly, this idea of ancestral lineage, it prescribes a really intense cultural pressure for all men to marry in order to continue and to preserve their family line. However, this expectation for all men to marry is threatened by the Chinese gender imbalance. So China has a distorted sex ratio of approximately 120 men to 100 women, and therefore a dearth of around 32 million women within the overall population of over 1 billion. Now, this gender imbalance is commonly attributed to the one-child policy of 1978, whereby a cultural preference for male children prompted gender-selective abortions. And consequently, within the marriage market, we see simply an oversupply of men. And this gender balance alongside patriarchal gender norms has caused a huge demand for wives through illegal means. So namely bride trafficking. Simply put, for many men, the simplest and cheapest way to marry is to purchase a wife. And scholars argue that this is not considered a disgrace, but rather an inherent right. I then think that this issue is perpetuated and in some ways facilitated by cultural marriage practices that can be distorted to justify forced marriage. So, for example, per Confucian thought, Chinese marriages are considered to be a practical family arrangement rather than some kind of romantic endeavour. So parents can carry within that practical family arrangement primary responsibility for the marriage of their children, and the cultural practice of employing a matchmaker to find a partner for the child is really common. And then this can be distorted in the context of Chinese bride trafficking, as some parents will directly engage in the practice to buy a wife for their son. And to take another example, in some and not all cases, the bride price is still being paid in China to compensate the loss of the daughter who will now benefit the husband's family. And this too can be utilised to ensure financial profit and consequent success of the bride trafficking process. And before moving on, I also just want to note, it's quite interesting here within literature, there is an agreement within the literature that this demand for bride trafficking is exacerbated in rural areas. So gender equality policies are now active in Chinese cities, and as a result, women are migrating from rural to urban areas in order to benefit from the consequent financial and social independence. On the contrary, the patrilocal marriage system deems rural men immobile. So the gender imbalance is exacerbated in rural areas. And as a result, literature agrees that this is primarily a rural issue. And there are entire villages that are being termed Myanmar bride villages or Vietnamese bride villages because of the high rates of Chinese bride trafficking. So that we can see here that there's an intersection of multiple factors that culminate in this widespread demand and indeed moral tolerance for Chinese bride trafficking. So to then consider the supply side of the problem, as I mentioned earlier, China's neighbouring nations are home to a supply of vulnerable women and girls to meet this Chinese demand for forced marriage. And this vulnerability, again, stems from a broad range of socioeconomic factors. And this includes extensive famine and economic devastation in North Korea, a lack of employment opportunities and rising debt levels in Cambodia, unemployment again and consequent poverty in Vietnam, and long-term racism, violence and armed conflict, which we see ongoing and currently being perpetuated in Myanmar. And so to just expand on this a bit more, literature agrees that the desire for improved socioeconomic circumstances is the key driver in the practice, and patriarchal attitudes and the subordinate position of women are also cited as key causes for the moral tolerance around this. Two primary forms of trafficking for forced marriage in China are reported. So firstly, trafficking under the guise or the false promise of employment, and secondly, deceptions regarding consensual marriage. Interestingly, and I think importantly, research also finds that women who are trafficked and are often exploited in other sectors during the process. And I note here that while trafficking for forced marriage does often include forced childbearing, and I do study the two together, they often do happen together, but they are not synonymous. And some studies have reported that 14% of participants were not forced to have sex while in their forced marriage. So I just wanted to clarify that distinction there. So hopefully that has painted a bit of a clearer picture of this social problem as a whole, kind of introducing you to it, I guess. And I say that existing literature does actually provide a really good basis. This is a really fast-growing field. There's lots of interest in it from lots of different really interesting perspectives. But there is this insufficient understanding of the role of gender and the role of feminism in the social construction of this problem. So I'll now present my research, which is aimed at bridging that gap. So I'll first set out my theory and methods, and the central research question is just here on the slides, simply what is the role of gender in the social problem. And I utilised a theoretical framework of social constructivist feminist theory, and I'm thereby interested in how socially constructed perceptions of gender and the gender dichotomy shape power inequalities between men and women. I conducted data collection via the Anti-Slavery Usable Past Voices Archive. So this is a really useful tool if you've not yet heard of it in your researching in this field. It is the world's largest archive of modern slavery narratives, and it's publicly available, and it holds over 900 survivor testimonies from around the world. Conveniently for me, this includes 46 narratives of survivors of forced marriage in China. So there's 26 from Myanmar, 12 from North Korea, 7 from Cambodia, and 1 from Vietnam. Now, this data set is limited, so most narratives are published by non-governmental organisations, so they've been edited for fundraising and awareness and are pre-existing, so they're not specifically iterative to my research question. And there's also a numerical distortion between the countries, including a skew to Myanmar, as I just mentioned. Yet this data is really very useful for two main reasons. So firstly, it enables a really survivor-informed, survivor-led, in some ways, answer to the research question. So I really consider that these survivor narratives are specialist knowledge presented by experts in the field, and therefore have potential to significantly enhance our understanding. And secondly, and to be honest, more pragmatically, because this is a really sensitive topic, and as I mentioned earlier, a really new and emerging field of research, it's argued that it's only prudent to first utilise all available secondary data before going in and conducting field work. So then looking at this data, I used thematic analysis, which really facilitated a flexible approach to the data, prioritising the voices of participants, which aligns well with the research questions, as I mentioned. And I followed Braun and Clark's guidance for this, conducting coding using NVivo. And due to the exploratory nature of the study, I take a really inductive approach to generate the themes with a specific awareness of reflexivity, which I've not gone on into just for matters of time. So to then present my findings and analysis, which I personally think is actually really interesting, I'll present these across the three core themes that were generated from the data in turn, and then I'll sort of bring them together to illustrate how what I argue this multi-level system of gender operates within and between these core themes. Just before I start, the chronological stages of Chinese bride trafficking were identified through the analysis, and these are identified as migration, marriage, and motherhood, and I utilised these throughout the presenting of findings and analysis. And also just a note to say that I follow the guidance of the database to acknowledge the survivor's name and the provenance of the narrative whenever I'm citing data, so that's why that's happening. Okay, so the first theme, perhaps unsurprisingly, is men exploiting women. So the male exploitation of women occurs across the three chronological stages of Chinese bride trafficking. So I'll take these in turn. Within the migration process, male brokers subject female victims to gender-based violence. So to take an example, it stated, the broker slapped me. This continued for a few days, then the broker raped me. The broker got mad. To calm himself down at night, he raped me. It was a violent rape. When I did not take off my clothes, he beat me. Then moving on, within the forced marriage, male husbands subject female victims to gender-based violence again. So we read, at night, I had to have sex with the Chinese man. I couldn't stand it. I kept crying, but then they beat me severely. I was not allowed to go outside. And then lastly, we find within the category of motherhood, female victims are subjected to rape within the forced marriage with the explicit purpose of forced childbearing. So it's stated that the Chinese man told me I would need to have a baby. I said, I don't want to have a baby. He pushed back and asked me to have a baby. So here, the masculine-feminine dichotomy is active in constructing power inequalities between the powerful male perpetrator and the powerless female victim, thus facilitating Chinese bride trafficking. Gender distinctions are performed across the three chronological stages, as I've just illustrated, and the dehumanization of women is really evident here as victims are treated in animalistic ways, including being beaten, held captive, forced to eat in their bedroom or cage, as some participants state, and forced to work. This is really epitomized as Suk Ju from North Korea recounts, I was not human in that house. And similarly, the control of female bodies and female sexuality is evident again across these three core chronological stages. And I just want to take a moment here to distinguish between gender and sex. So gender is defined as the socially constructed dichotomy of the masculine and feminine, whereas sex refers to the biological distinction between men and women. So it may be argued that forced childbearing, for example, is not a question of gender but of sex, since it's based on female biology and reproductive organs and not socially constructed perceptions of femininity, which would be considered gender. However, to draw this dichotomy between sex and gender is, in this case study, overly simplistic. So instead, I understand these as co-constructed concepts, and the act of childbearing, for example, is a distinctly female pursuit dictated by sex, but forced childbearing involves actions of gender-based violence and rape, which are facilitated by gendered hierarchies that deem men more powerful than women. So we are looking at both gender and sex in this example. Now, through these actions, the male control of women facilitates Chinese bride trafficking. In each case, gendered expectations of the dominant masculinity and submissive femininity are played out in disproportionate male power and control over victims. And this directly facilitates the practice of migration, marriage, and motherhood without female consent. So in summary, the socially constructed masculine femininity dichotomy and consequent power inequalities play a central role in Chinese bride trafficking. Now, moving on to the second core theme, interestingly, we find that to view exploitation within Chinese bride trafficking as a purely male pursuit is overly simplistic, since female perpetrators also exploit female victims across the three chronological stages again. So the second core theme here is women exploiting women, and I'll just illustrate some of the data. So within the migration element of the process, female perpetrators assist in the recruitment and trafficking of victims. So for example, it's stated, when we arrived in the Shan Chinese state, the Shan Chinese woman locked the door from the outside and warned us not to run away. She said, if we try to run, she'll cut off our hands and legs. Moving on into the marriage part of the process, parents of Chinese husbands, so specifically here we're looking at the mother-in-law, also abused victims. So it stated, then the mother beat me. Every time I was beaten, I did not know what to do. I was bleeding from my nose and my mouth. No matter what, they beat me. And then lastly, within motherhood, the mother-in-law also exercises violence and manipulation to achieve forced childbearing. So it stated, I was locked in the room for 1 year before I had a baby. The family members, especially the mother-in-law, treated me badly. Her face was furious. Sometimes they didn't feed me because I didn't get pregnant as soon as possible. So to then draw out some analysis here as well, we find that constructions of gender are really interesting here because there's no female-male dichotomy as per the last theme. Instead, I argue that these femininities are plural and that what we're seeing here is gender hierarchies that are operating on a continuum. So for example, marriage instigated often by the mother-in-law who exercises control over the victim as she purchases a wife for her son. And then this control is maintained since the couple will typically live in the husband's family home, and therefore the mother-in-law is more powerful than the victim. And a hierarchy of femininities is formed within the family whereby the victim is exploited by her more powerful mother-in-law, as evidenced through the physical violence and the restriction of food and obligatory housework and caring responsibilities that we see in this data. Social constructions of gender also play an active role within these hierarchies of femininity. So the femininity of the broker facilitates exploitation of social constructions of women as caring, encourage victims to believe the false promises of employment. Moreover, forced childbearing encouraged by the mother-in-law still relies on the gender and sex of the victim. And so in summary, we can see that the role of gender here is way more complicated than a dichotomy of male-female that simply subordinates women and honors men. Rather, it's contended that socially constructed gender perceptions of gender operate on a continuum whereby hierarchies of femininity deem female brokers and female mothers-in-law in this case study more powerful than the victims. And within these hierarchies, constructions of gender continue to have an active role in shaping power inequalities. Moving on then to the final theme, it's found that structural manifestations of gender also assist in Chinese bride trafficking. So gender operates within and between actually the individual and the structural social field. So analysis so far has really focused on the individual structural field. So we've been looking at individual perpetrators, both male and female. So analysis now turns to focus on the structural social field within the practice of Chinese bride trafficking. So to again paint a bit of a picture of the data within migration, the pressure to provide for one's family through marriage to a Chinese man is reported to be a push factor encouraging female migration to China. So it stated, if I wanted to ensure my family's well-being, I had to marry a Chinese man. My family would live on the money they got from selling me. Moving on then into the next chronological stage of marriage, a key element of Chinese bride trafficking is the sale of women through the bride price. It stated the bride's price tag depends on her age and looks. The youngest and best looking ones sell for up to 20,000 yuan. A bride that's worth only 3,000 yuan is tough to sell. Now, data here didn't include significant evidence of structural manifestation, structural expectation of women in the latter chronological stage of motherhood. But we can still see that social constructions of gender are embedded into these structural practices that play a key role in Chinese bride trafficking. So again, just to spend a minute here unpacking this in a bit more detail. Within marriage, the bride price is a structural commodification of women that relies on socially constructed gendered expectations of brides and grooms in the forced marriage. So narratives show that expectations of femininity, namely physical appearance, sexual history, and age, are utilized to determine the bride price. Yet the same expectations are not made of the men marrying these women. So per Sukju from North Korea, most of the men who buy their brides tend to be physically or mentally ill, extremely lazy, or the poorest men in the village. In short, we were being sold to unmarriageable men. So here we can see that the bride price is a structural manifestation of these social constructions of gender that facilitate and justify the subordination of women through forced marriage. Then within migration, there's also this uniquely female pressure to provide for women to provide for their families in neighbouring nations through marriage to a Chinese man. So this push factor stems directly from patriarchal norms that justify the demand for bride trafficking in the first place, and it also relies on the bride price to ensure that the process is profitable and that the family are therefore able to receive payment for the marriage of their daughter. So this theme is actually, I think, really interesting because we see that these social constructions of gender are embedded into structural practices that also play a key and an interdependent role in shaping these power equalities that further perpetuate Chinese bride trafficking. So then, to draw these three core themes together, it's evident that the data paints a complex and a nuanced picture of the dynamics of gender within the Chinese bride trafficking process. And I argue that whilst these three core themes do operate independently, they also operate interdependently if we take another look at the data. And they intersect to form this multi-level system of gender that I've mentioned. And so I'll just illustrate this briefly across the three core chronological stages in turn. There's loads of really interesting data here that I wish I had time to share, but I'll be brief. I'll just take one example. So first, within migration, we read one participant states, I believed her and I thought I was so lucky. The broker told me there would be no need to use my ID card in China, and if someone found it, they would know we were illegal. So that's why she took the ID card. Me and my friend tried to stay together. We held each other and tried to stay together, but the Chinese men got mad and dragged us apart. So here within this migration process, we can see the core theme of women exploiting women. So in the female broker who takes the ID card but I believed her and thought I was so lucky. So it's kind of within this first step of the migration process is actually acting in collaboration with the male perpetrators who then later get mad and drag them apart. So here we see the two core themes of men exploiting women and women exploiting women intersecting within the first chronological stage of migration. So then to move on to marriage, similarly, it's stated, last time my husband hit me, he even said, do you have any idea how much I paid for you? So again, here within the marriage, we see this intersection between men exploiting women as a key theme, with the husband hitting the wife, and then also this idea of structures exploiting women with the, do you have any idea how much I paid for you, which points to the bride price. And then within the last chronological stage of motherhood, we read, in the beginning, they locked me in a room. The Chinese boy and I slept together, but we never had sex because we did not know about it. After 2 months, his parents took us and checked into the hospital to see if I was pregnant or not. They saw no pregnancy. Then the mum complained. She talked to her son, my husband, and gave him some money, gave him some sex films to watch. Then after he watched some kinds of movies, we started having sex. So lastly, within this practice of forced childbearing, we see that the control of the mother-in-law, so coded under women exploiting women, is realised through the gender-based violence and rape inflicted by the husband, coded as men exploiting women. So I hope that's kind of painted a bit of a picture, and as I said, there's multiple other examples of these intersections. But I argue that here the role of gender within Chinese bride trafficking is definitely most accurately understood as this multi-level system whereby multiple social constructions of gender operate both individually and also in collaboration with each other to facilitate, justify, and therefore perpetuate Chinese bride trafficking. And so this multi-level system of gender has been demonstrated across time, so across the 3 chronological stages of migration, marriage and motherhood, across the x-axis there. It's been demonstrated across the social fields, both individual and structural, along the y-axis. And it's also been demonstrated across different models of socially constructed gender relations, so the 3 core themes of men, women and structures exploiting women in the middle there. So this paints a complex and nuanced picture of how these socially constructed perceptions of gender operate throughout the Chinese bride trafficking process, playing a core role by dictating gendered imbalances of power which facilitate and justify the practice. Now, before I finish, I want to note that this study does hold several limitations. So this really does invite further research if you're interested. But firstly, the data is really heavily biased towards victims in Myanmar and also North Korea, and there was only one testimony, I think, from Cambodia. And so it's therefore not necessarily, in fact, it's unlikely to be representative of the 4 nations. So this field would benefit from further research assessing these discrepancies and indeed similarities in the role of gender between the 4 home nations of Cambodia, Myanmar, North Korea and Vietnam. Secondly, data focuses on survivor narratives and consequently doesn't account for women who may still be trapped in forced marriage. So although this is practically almost unfeasible, it would of course be highly valuable to the field to have empirical research that speaks with women who are still within a forced marriage in China. And then lastly, there is an assumption of heteronormativity within my research. So I don't fully consider the role of masculinity within Chinese bride trafficking, and further research considering non-heteronormative and male perspectives would be useful in further understanding how varied masculinities and femininities operate within this social problem. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope that you find it as interesting as I do, and that it's been useful to you in some way. If you have any questions or would like to discuss anything further, please do get in contact with me. I really do welcome that. And as I say, thank you so much for your attention.